Welcome back to the Media Roundtable. This is the first episode of our brand new season and a brand new year. And what do you think? Is it going to be 2020 part 3? Or are we going to feel some progress and cause for hope this year? Well, you're doing your part to make things better just by joining us at the Media Roundtable. We're talking to leading podcast voices about what they create, why they create it, and the impact they want it to have on the world. So whether you're a member of the media or the marketing community, or a podcast listener who just cares about this country and the messages that you advance, and you want to help feel better about what you consume, distribute, and support, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dan Granger, and today we're joined by Bari Weiss. Now, who is Bari Weiss? If you're aligned with the work that we've been doing through the Media Roundtable, then you probably know all about her. She defies labels. She confounds those who would put her in a box. And she is a serious person and a brave person. In fact, as a journalist and author of How to Fight Anti-Semitism, she's been awarded for things like courage and integrity in journalism, among many other honors. Bari was a staff writer and editor for the opinion section of the New York Times until she left in 2020 after releasing her now famous resignation letter, which is a must read. She writes a newsletter today at barryweiss.substack.com and hosts a podcast called Honestly, which you can find at honestlypod.com. We're going to talk about that today. And, just a few more fun facts. Her star has risen so high that she has the internet buzzing from her an interview that she did a couple of weeks ago with Kim Kardashian. And was bestowed an even greater honor when she got a shout out on this current season of Curb Your Enthusiasm. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Bari is someone we've been trying to land for over a year, and because she lives and breathes the work that the Media Roundtable exists to do. So she can probably explain our efforts better than I've been able to do in 2 years of doing this podcast. So Bari Weiss, thank you and welcome to the Media Roundtable.
What a nice introduction. Thank you for having me.
So let's start here. Who is Bari Weiss?
I don't know, man. Who am I? Who am I really, or who does the internet say I am?
Well, actually, I'm interested in both of those, as a matter of fact. I'm interested in what you think, like, your brand is. Like, what do people think of when they think Bari Weiss? And then what do you think of?
What I think of when I think of Bari Weiss is, I don't know. I still listen to the Indigo Girls. I'm not cool, I wouldn't say. I'm someone who tries to put my values above the trend of the day and above being popular. That's the thing that I aspire to do, certainly in my journalism work, but also in my life. I'm a serious Jew. I am the wife of a great woman named Nellie Bowles. I'm someone who tries to be a mensch. So those are some of the things that I am. But if you Google me, that's not exactly what you're going to find. I think you'll find all sorts of things. I think, like lots of people who are unwilling to slot themselves into a political box right now, you become a kind of cipher, and you become a different person depending on which reality bubble you're living in. So it's like, is Dave Chappelle the greatest stand-up comic of all time? Or is Dave Chappelle literally killing trans women? We could go down the line. There's so many people that I think are increasingly sort of being dehumanized and turned into totems. And to some extent, obviously not on the level of Dave Chappelle, but to some extent, I think a little bit that's happened to me. So I have to say that it's one of the questions I get most often is like, what's it like to be so hated? And it's a question and a reality online that I really have worked very hard, especially over the past 2 years, to divorce myself from, because I think the more that you pay attention to that noise, the more fearful you get, and the more it sort of corrupts at least my aspiration, which is to be as truthful and honest, transparent, and authentic as possible.
So that's interesting. So when you contrast your experience in real life versus the digital world, or what people who don't know you might think of you, do the ratios stay the same on positive to negative?
No.
How does that work?
Well, mostly people that are online, especially anonymously, are cowards in real life. I maybe had a few, maybe in Brooklyn, a few negative experiences. But I'll tell you, I mean, I was having brunch in LA yesterday, and this adorable dad walked by and sort of turned around and came up to me and Nellie and said, "I just love the work that you're doing." Same thing happened to me in the Toronto airport recently. I actually ended up having breakfast with one of my readers who is a lawyer and is thinking about shifting careers, and we talked all about it. I was at Duke recently speaking, and some professors came who were readers of mine. So in real life, I have to tell you, maybe this is sort of like giving up a little bit of my cred, but in real life, it's incredible. And
Mm.
I have to say that I've never had more interactions with readers and listeners than I have in the past 9 months since I launched my newsletter. That never used to happen to me really when I was at the Times. So it's extremely gratifying to know that you can sort of hang up a shingle and people actually come and listen and read and engage.
Well, and I want to talk about your experience at the Times and that your transition to what you're doing now. But before we go into that, can we go back to 2018 and talk about your book,
Sure.
How to Fight Anti-Semitism? Can you break down the central premise of that book?
Sure. Well, the context for me writing it, which is probably important to start with, is that I grew up in Squirrel Hill. I grew up quite literally in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. His house was in the heart of
Wow.
Squirrel Hill, which is the Jewish community. And looking back, and it's only sort of as I went out into the world that I realized this, like many people realize when they go beyond their ken, is just what a special community I grew up in. It would sort of function like a 21st century shtetl. We all knew each other. It was very unlike, as much as I love New York and LA and the Jewish communities there, they're so big that you sort of have the luxury of staying inside your religious or denominational or political or cultural bubble, even inside the Jewish community. It wasn't like that in Pittsburgh. We all knew each other. Anyway, fast forward to that morning in October when a white supremacist named Robert Bowers walked into Tree of Life, which is the synagogue where I had become a bat mitzvah. And he said all Jews must die. And then he killed 11 people. And it was the most lethal attack on Jews in American history. My dad sometimes can be found at Tree of Life. He's kind of a promiscuous Jew in the sense that he floats around to different services depending on what they're serving for lunch, basically. And he wasn't there that day, but we had a group text, and my mom said immediately, like, we're definitely going to know people. We knew 6 of the 11 people that were murdered.
Mm.
And looking back, Dan, on my life, I write this in the book, but in retrospect, it was like I was on a holiday from history. What do I mean by that? I grew up in a very serious, I don't mean Orthodox, but just we took our Judaism seriously. We were really proud to be Jews. We were big supporters of the state of Israel. We talked all the time about Jewish history and certainly about rising anti-Semitism in Europe. I could tell you in great detail, who was killed in various suicide bombings in Jerusalem, or, who tortured Ilan Halimi in France and why. So it wasn't as if we were ignorant to history and ignorant to what was going on in the world, but we believed, and I was raised on this beautiful myth that America was somehow uniquely inoculated from this virus that I believe is encoded in the DNA of Western civilization. And so when little things happened to me when I was growing up, I remember waiting for the school bus to take me to Jewish day school with my sister Casey, and a Catholic school bus drove by and they screamed "kikes" and "dirty Jews." Or I remember people telling me to pick up pennies. And you could, okay, that's terrible. But you know what my experience of them was? They rolled off my back. And the reason that they did was that it seemed to me that they didn't grasp what America was about, that they were somehow like vestiges of an uglier time and place, and that I, in my full Jewish self, was fully American, and that there was no contradiction between those two things, and that in no way was that harmony under threat. And I think what began that morning in October with the attack on Tree of Life, and then 6 months later to the day, the attack on Poway in California, a gunman walks into a Chabad synagogue, shoots people. When I visited a week after the fact, there were still bullet holes in the wall, or the machete attack in Muncie during Hanukkah the following year, or the attack on the kosher supermarket in Jersey City, or the rolling attacks completely almost overlooked by the press that have been taking place against Haredi Jews, the most visible Jews in neighborhoods of Brooklyn like Borough Park and Crown Heights and Williamsburg. Well, this all adds up to a picture that maybe the myth that I was raised on, that somehow anti-Semitism was so, that it could never rise here, maybe that was not true. And maybe, the reason that America had been such a unique experience, the best experience for Jews in all of diasporic history by far, was because we were wedded to a certain set of values and cultural mores. And the more that we moved away from them, well, then the more anti-Semitism was going to rise. And so the reason that I wrote that book was partially to understand that phenomenon for myself, but also to understand how anti-Semitism functions differently than racism. Because I think a convenient way to understand it, and sometimes it does function this way, is just like racism against Jews, right? It's quotas at country clubs, or, not selling to Jews in certain neighborhoods, all of which used to take place, or, keeping the cap of Jews in a class at Harvard to 3, whatever the case is, right? And so in that sense, it does look like racism, but anti-Semitism is actually different than that. I'm not comparing them. It just functions differently. It functions like a conspiracy theory that sort of gives a society or an institution or a culture a way of explaining the world. And it's only when you understand that it functions as a kind of shape-shifting conspiracy theory, that you understand how under Nazism, Jews were the race contaminators, and how under communism, Jews were the bourgeois, they're the arch capitalists, and how today in America, where the lens is race, the right is saying the Jews are essentially the greatest trick the devil has ever played. They appear to be white, but in fact, look at them. They're not real white people. They're loyal to Black people and brown people and Muslims, which is, of course, why Robert Bauer selected Tree of Life. It had participated the previous week in Refugee Shabbat. And yet, at the same time that the right is saying that we are essentially fake white people, the left is saying, look at them, they're the uber white people. They're hyper white. Why? Because they say they're minorities, but look at them. They benefit from white privilege. They're adjacent to white supremacy. And not only that, they're also guilty to what they say is not the Jewish return to their indigenous homeland, but the last standing bastion of white colonialism in the Middle East, which is Israel. And so when you understand anti-Semitism in that more complicated way, all of those contradictions begin to make sense.
So one question is, are we minorities or not?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. Because when you hear the argument that, Jews are privileged, Jews benefit from being able to pass, that is true. It was also true in Germany. It's also been true in many other times and places for Jews. It's about whether or not that can be stripped away. And the question of whether or not well, I'll ask you. I assume you're Jewish, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, no, I am. It's complex with me because I'm also a Christian, and as I'm getting older, reconciling those two parts of my identity is becoming, it's quite a journey.
So, did you grow up Jewish and convert to Christianity?
So I did convert to Christianity. I was baptized Catholic as a baby, if you want to keep up with that. And but I am 70, as it turns out, from 23andMe, I am 73% Ashkenazi. So what do you do with me? But yeah, so I went to Israel when I turned 40.
Wow.
And I've been, and it was helpful for me because I started to see how these two parts of myself work together. I still haven't quite figured it out, but I'm trying to learn more about it. And your book was actually very helpful in that process for me.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, you have a standing invitation for Shabbat dinner when you're next in LA.
Well, I live here, so I'll see you Friday. So anyway, it's interesting because it seems like what you did was everybody goes, okay, we see the far right extremists because they're very overt, right? But you're rooting out anti-Semitism on the left and in intellectual circles, where I don't think that's that's not a thesis that a lot of people probably want to acknowledge. And so,
That's
what was
right.
it like? What was it like publishing that? Because this is before the resignation. It was a different time. How was that received, and how has that been received over time?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that one of the biggest knocks against me is that somehow I am excusing or somehow blind to anti-Semitism from the right. It's a strange criticism, only given my personal experience with my community, and frankly, the kind of threats that I have now gotten used to managing in my daily life. I
Mm,
mean, the violent threats come from the right. There's not a question about it. And
mm,
whenever I do an event in a Jewish space, there's either armed guards, there's personal security, there's metal detectors. This is the reality, by the way, now for Jews living in America. Like the amount of we'll go to a synagogue in LA and you'll see it's more intense in certain ways than going through TSA. And we've gotten used to that. You know, I remember after Tree of Life, my friends in on the Upper West Side send their kid to a Jewish preschool, and it was all of a sudden from just a bodyguard at the door to then to armed guard. This is normal part of life. So in no way am I trying to suggest that the more physically lethal threat doesn't come from the right. It most certainly does.
mm,
And I don't think there's a question about that. What I'm also saying, though, is that that doesn't mean that we can't be incredibly worried about the more insidious threat that comes from the left. Why insidious? Because it doesn't say all Jews must die. It's because it comes cloaked in the language of righteousness, of social justice, of progress, and of all of these things that are frankly a siren song to liberal ears, and I'll say to the majority of American Jewish ears. And so as a result, I think we are caught very flat footed by it. It also, frankly, often comes cloaked in the language of criticism of Israel. And so it's like, well, Zion, in my view, it's a little bit, and I'm stealing a line here from an incredible young man called Blake Flayton, who, if people don't know him, they should look him up. We
mm,
got to know each other because he read my book and wrote me a long letter about it. Then he got published in the New York Times, and now he's on to a fabulous career as a writer and an activist. He's spectacular. And he was pushed out of the kind of queer activist leftist communities that he was in
mm,
because he refused to disavow Israel. And he has said that anti-Semitism from the right, it's like a bullet to the head. And anti-Semitism from the left is like a frog in boiling water.
mm.
And I think that there's a lot of truth to that, because it doesn't say, we need to kill you. It says you need to erase this part of yourself. And then it keeps upping the bargain of what you need to erase in order to become acceptable. And this is a kind of anti-Semitism. They didn't used to call it right and left, but with very, very deep roots in Jewish history.
Hmm. Now, you used a metaphor. I don't know if it was in the book, but I've heard you talk about a David versus Goliath concept in terms of how people deal with anti-Semitism. Can you explain that a little bit?
I actually don't know I know I've used that analogy when it comes to Israel,
So,
but say more
so,
what you mean.
so on one camp, in one camp, you've got people that are kind of saying like, we have to be on guard at all times and can be hypersensitive. And on the other side, it's kind of like, oh, that's all behind us, to each his own. And the central notion I think you're trying to put forth, and you'll say this much more clearly than I am, is that we have a hard time holding two contradictory ideas in our minds,
Right.
right?
Right. So I think what you're saying is, how is it that the Jews or American Jewish community can be, obviously there are poor Jews, there are struggling Jews, the Jews are like any other group. We've got
Mm-hmm.
everyone.
Yep.
But how is it that they can be such a small percentage of the population and punch so above their weight?
Mm-hmm.
And yet, how is it also true that I think since 1995, according to FBI crime statistics, the majority of hate crimes against minorities take place every single year against Jews? How are both of those things possible? And the answer is both of those things are possible. And yet we live in a world in which, as you just said, Dan, people have a very hard time holding two things in their heads at once. Take the example of Ilhan Omar, right? And why was it so difficult for people to criticize Ilhan Omar when she said anti-Semitic things? And the reason is, understandably, that they looked at the hate that was going Ilhan Omar's way. They looked at the xenophobia and the bigotry that people had no problem lodging at her, and they thought, well, wait, isn't she the victim? And it's like both are true. You can be both the victim and the victimizer. And people, like, take the example of a lot of the people that have been carrying out the physical assaults against Black hat Jews, against Haredi Jews in Brooklyn, are young men of color. That is the reason that so many people have not wanted to speak out against it. Why? Because in the case of Robert Bowers, in the case of a neo-Nazi white supremacist, is moral clarity. It's completely clear. He goes in, he's evil, he's obviously part of the oppressor category, and he assaults, completely innocent people who, by the way, look like me and you. What does it mean in the case of a Brooklyn attack when the person carrying out the attack is probably, experienced tremendous amount of racism in their life? Let's assume that. And maybe comes from a broken home, who knows? And in our minds, or in the minds of any good, like, liberal mind right now, is someone that we view as a victim. But then they're assaulting someone who, by the way, according to the liberal view of the world, we view as sort of a backward fundamentalist. So where's our sympathy supposed to lie? And I think one of the reasons that I've been so outspoken against whatever we want to call it, the successor ideology, the illiberal left, woke ideology, I don't really care what we want to call it, but it's the ideology that is Manichaean and sees the world in terms of black and white, and basically suggests that you are sort of constrained to the lane of your birth, for better or for worse. You're born either an oppressor or oppressed. Well, it literally blinds you to seeing the world. It blinds you and sort of prevents you from speaking up against, in this case, real evil. And I think that it, in a way, at its root, is just deeply, deeply anti-human, because it both says that we are born to be what we're going to be. It says we can't change our minds. It says we can't have a second chance or redeem ourselves. And I oppose that both as a humanist and as a Jew and as an American, frankly. That was a long answer, but I hope
it's very helpful. And I feel like what you've identified on this topic also extends into the causes of our political polarization, right? Because my perception is most people are much more comfortable treating our differences as like it's all a Western, and you got black hats and you got white hats, and things are real simple and really clear cut. And I don't know if that's just the way things have always been and always will be, or if we're at in a different place right now that is truly as unsustainable as it feels. What's your take on that?
I'm not sure.
Let me say it different.
Okay.
So can we agree that there's a lot of oversimplification happening where people want to put you in one of two boxes, right?
Yeah. So that's kind of why I
kind of your thing. It's kind of our thing. Yeah. So knowing that, has it always been that way? Or has it really shifted where we can't see gray anymore and we used to be able to?
So I think what's going on is that we are ejecting or being ejected or have been ejected from what we now see was a post-war consensus that, probably the high point of it was the Clinton presidency. And it was this idea that, center right, center left, not such a big difference. And now it feels like everything is higher stakes, that consensus is gone. And you hear it a lot, right, in the kind of nostalgia for, would that we would still have Walter Cronkite and one television station to watch. How terrible is it that everything is so atomized and that depending on what you watch or read or listen to, you live in a different reality. Now, obviously, I think that to some extent, not that consensus was an illusion, but there was biases sort of built into that consensus that people are overlooking. But I think it is absolutely true that we are sort of being pulled back into the mean of history, if I can put it that way. I think
Interesting.
what we're living in, and this thing that's making us all anxious and uncomfortable and angsty,
Mm-hmm.
is the way that things have been. And the glorious post-war bubble was the exception. And so I definitely think that this is more, much more normal. And frankly, we're so very far from that mean, but it's just that we are being pulled a little bit closer to it than I think a lot of us are comfortable with.
Let me echo that back and see if I'm getting it. We had Ben Smith on a few months back, and
Yeah.
he had an interesting perspective on this too. He was kind of like, we've got this notion of like two sides to a story and even-handedness. He's like, but it was really kind of a strange feature in American journalism in the 20th century that we thought that that's how things go, but that was actually the anomaly. And what we're doing is much more along the line of history when you look at the full scope.
I agree with that. And I think that it took me a while to get here, but I think that there is some virtue in the transparency that's coming in this moment. It's scary to look at some of it. But on the other hand, I think that, the idea, let's say that the New York Times was always the objective paper, the paper of record, like that was never true. And now we can see it for what it is, just to choose one of a zillion examples.
Yeah.
Now you could say, well, no, the New York Times is just transformed and it used to be. Do we really think that? I agree it has transformed. But the question is, was that sense of objectivity that we all bought into, was it an illusion? And was it an illusion based on sort of lack of options in the market? You would know the answer to that, frankly, better than me.
Well, yeah, I buy what you're saying. I mean, it's kind of like, the notion that we had a president that people didn't know couldn't walk. You had it doesn't mean that they were being fully transparent and he could walk just because we didn't know that. We just didn't have a million crowdsourced opportunities to go, I have a picture of him not able to walk, right? So like I think that there's been a lot of things hidden in plain sight historically, and
Exactly.
now we're a lot more aware of it, but it's just so confusing now because there's no agreement on what they should be doing, let alone what they are doing, right? Like we're not even on like first principles with this anymore, I feel like. And that's what's gotten kind of wacky in journalism. And, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's right. And I think we're in this weird liminal place because people don't trust the old institutions.
Right.
Okay, that's over.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we all see that living in a world without institutions or gatekeepers is chaos. And, what do you do and how do you build trustworthy companies, institutions, journalistic platforms go down the line in a world where the notion of an institution is something that makes people skeptical or repelled? And that's something I'm thinking about constantly.
Yeah. Well, and also it's something that you're doing something about because I mean, look, you're probably sick of talking about the New York Times at this point. So we can go over that part quickly, but can you just describe your process of going from what you were there to do, which is bring in different perspectives, right? And then choosing to leave that to launch something independent to go closer to the model that I think you're describing.
Yeah. I had come to the New York Times from the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
At the Wall Street Journal editorial page, I was, I guess I have some kind of masochistic thing. I like being politically homeless, weirdly. And at the Wall Street Journal, I was definitely the most left-leaning person there. Like they would, call me a squish and all these other things. It was a great place to work. That's like where I put in my 10,000 hours that Malcolm Gladwell talks about. It's where I learned how to do everything. Fast forward, Trump becomes the candidate. Fast forward a little more, Trump becomes the nominee. And like everyone saw in the conservative movement, the Republican Party, there was an intense sort of battle inside the editorial page. And I definitely found myself on the never Trump side. And so after he won the election, And at the very same time, right, you had the New York Times, which everyone will remember the night of the election and the infamous needle having Hillary winning by like 99.9%. And whoops, they got it totally wrong. And so there was this window of laudable, like soul searching that happened. And I was brought in as an intellectual diversity hire, straight up. Like I was brought in along with Brett Stevens, who's going to be a columnist. My job was to bring in pieces that would sort of show readers the other side.
It was a great idea.
Yeah, and frankly, I'm extremely proud of the work that I did. I mean, I brought in voices that never would have otherwise appeared in the New York Times. And, you know, and not just, by the way, libertarians or conservatives or heterodox people, but also like, you know, a Christian dissident in Hong Kong. That was one of the best essays. An Iranian chess player who left the country because she didn't want to play forced to cover her hair. You know, survivors of suicide. I mean, like, I love journalism. I love finding new voices, and the idea that you get to do that and have millions of people read it was just about the most gratifying thing in the world for me. Now, alongside that, from the very beginning, it wasn't the most hospitable, warm place. Now, that is maybe just a feature of the Times, as lots of alumni will tell you. But for me, in my case, I would say it was definitely tinged with the political, in the sense that I was somehow smelled bad or was, you know, super right wing, all of which is kind of crazy if you know me and my views in my life, but whatever. But all of that was manageable, meaning it was fine that I wasn't popular and that certain of my colleagues literally never spoke to me because I got to do my work. When it became the case that I was prevented from doing my work, that's when everything started to change. And that was the case both with pieces that I wanted to write and also with the kinds of pieces that I wanted to bring in. It was just, it became like the sort of window of possibility was narrowed to a sliver. And I had a choice to make, a choice that I think a lot of people in a lot of institutions find themselves with, you know, that are going through this kind of ideological takeover. Do you stay and sit on your hands and cling to the prestige and, you know, pull in a good paycheck? And by the way, have the, you know, the good feeling of telling people you work at a fancy place that they admire. You know, that's, I don't want to, that's a real thing. And the cocktail party cachet. Or do you risk giving that up? And obviously not obviously, maybe people have no clue who I am. But the boiling point came following the brouhaha after we decided to, I wasn't even involved in the op-ed, but
oh, really?
Yeah, it had nothing to do with the op-ed. I was
okay.
sort of strung up for it. But the paper ran an op-ed by Republican Senator Tom Cotton that was called Bring in the Troops. And it was talking about bringing in the National Guard to quell not peaceful protests, but violent riots. This led to a total uproar in the paper. More than 800 colleagues signed a letter saying that the op-ed literally put Black lives in danger. And I've written a lot about moral panics. It was very different writing about it than like seeing it play out and seeing people, you know, be completely carried away by it. And it ultimately, within 72 hours, I think, led to the demotion of my wonderful boss, Jim Dow, who had been at the paper for most of his career, and James Bennett, who was the editorial page editor who hired me, who had been the former Jerusalem bureau chief. And once they were willing to push him out, I saw like, wait, what does this mean? So this means that taking a risk to publish a piece that is well within the mainstream of American viewpoints. I think 53% of Americans at that time polled agreed with his position, but puts you on the outs with your colleagues and potentially with readers. Well, it looks like getting fired. And this is someone who had spent decades working for the paper, not me. You know, I'd been there for 3 years. So it was like, well, if they just revealed what they were willing to stand by and not. And I think everyone felt like, oh no, like this is the punishment for taking a risk, or this is the punishment for trying to do your job. And ultimately, by the end, there was so much panic over not wanting to sort of commit the same so-called mistake that an editing system was put in place. I kid you not, that was called like Red Flag, or I forget, but it was basically like every single op-ed had to be signed off by every single editor. And it needed to be confirmed that it made them not feel uncomfortable. Well, guess what? My literal job was to bring in pieces that would make people uncomfortable. So by the end of my time there, they said to me, we just want you writing full time. We don't want you commissioning pieces, because they knew they couldn't get through. And then it was like, well, hold on. I can't write half the columns I want to write about. I can't commission op-eds anymore. What am I doing here? What am I doing here? And it was a real soul searching, extremely intense time for me of just looking at my life and really asking myself, like, what is, this is it. You got one life. What's it about? Is it about telling people you work at the New York Times and like letting your grandparents have bragging rights? Or is it about do what you went into journalism to do in the first place? And I chose the latter.
Yeah. Well, and you did it in fantastic form.
Thank you.
Had this, the letter was magnificent, and you did it in this Jerry Maguire fashion. What was it like for you after you hit send on that? Like,
I'm not
that experience.
I was real shaky. I was just like sweating a lot, and gave my sister my phone. And I understand it was like really huge online, but I tried to close my eyes and not look for a while. But honestly, it's funny. I find making really I'm capable of making really big decisions, but it doesn't mean that it feels easy.
Yeah.
And that one I knew was the right thing, but it was still hard for me to do, if that makes sense.
Well, that's what makes it courage, right?
Well, that's a nice word to use. I'll say that the very first call I got was from one of my heroes, Ayan Hirsi, who just said to me, if there's anything you need, if you need a job, if you need whatever you need, like, I'm here for you to help you. And there were a few calls that day that I will just absolutely never forget, that drowned out all the noise. And that's just been true in my entire career. And this is often the advice that I give young writers and just young people trying to speak their mind and tell the truth in an era where that's not rewarded, which is look for the few voices that you really, really respect, and really use those people as your North Star, because it will drown out all of the mobs online.
So thank you for sharing all that and retelling. Talk about how you came to decide about your new ventures. We know about Common Sense, your Substack, and honestly, the podcast. Those are the two primary, right?
That's it for now, but I'm ramping up.
We know where you're going.
Where do you think I'm going?
I think you're going to build a network. I think you're going to blow this thing out.
I hope so.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the newsletter, basically I left. I drank a lot. Yeah. I had a lot of long walks listening to podcasts. And literally, Nellie and I, my wife, were on the plane to Miami. She was going to do a great story that the Times published about how Miami is becoming like the new tech capital. And she started the Substack for me. She set up my account and she said, I'm begging you, enough, write a column. And I wrote a column on that plane ride.
How far away are we from when you resigned?
It's a good question. A few months, maybe
several months,
5 months.
And were you doing any press? Were you talking to anybody? Or were you under the radar?
I was pretty under the radar. I didn't feel ready to. I put it all in the letter. Like what else was there to say? Like I left it all on the field. I'm bad at sports analogies, sports phrases, but I did, and I wasn't sure there was anything to say. And I also felt like I wanted to just get really like centered. I hate to use that word. It sounds so woo-woo, but I had to before I did my next thing. And so when I did the first Substack column, I got this call from the Substack people being like, you could have told us, but I didn't take an advance, and I just started doing it, and it really just took off. And the thing that I'm most proud about is, and I'm not sure anyone else has been able to do this quite on the newsletter. The new Substack is really built for individual writers, you know? And I think that I've managed to sort of make it into the kind of, I don't know, week in review that I would want to read. And I think I've managed to elevate a lot of writers who I admire, and put them on my readers' radar. So that's been really exciting. And then, I don't know, I've lost track of time in COVID. I thought it was 2020 the other day, but I think
Yeah.
4 or 5 months ago, I launched the podcast, and I'm having total blast with it. And I think the thing that um, I'm trying to do with both of those things and with future projects is to marry like the blue chip quality that people are used to getting from mainstream establishment institutions with the kind of punk energy of the new media landscape. And I hope that I'm fulfilling that. But that's kind of my aim, because there's a lot of amazing podcasts I love to listen to, but they're either inaccessible because they're so internety. Like it's like if I played them for my mom, she would be confused every other line.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to make this understandable to everyone's mom, but also be um, forward looking and pushing the boundary.
Well, and it seems like from the early momentum that you have that the marketplace is recognizing the distinction of the fact that you are investing in quality. And, we can imagine that all podcasts are just somebody talking into a microphone about whatever's on the top of their mind, but you're a journalist and you prepare. Um,
Yeah.
are you finding that you prep more or less than when you're writing a story? I'm sure it depends, but on average.
It's just a different skill.
Yeah.
And I'm in
Do you
the
love
hand.
it?
I'm loving it more and more. In the beginning, I really didn't like it because
Really?
yeah, I hadn't been bad at something in a long time. And I was bad. Like there were a few early episodes that will never see the light of day because it's a different skill, right? When you're interviewing someone and trying to get them to open up to you and give a
Yeah.
quote for a story, there's a lot of ways you can do that, right? And it's different when you're trying to, the story is the conversation.
Yeah.
It's a very different framework. And I've just been so unbelievably lucky in the producers that I'm working with. And we just have so much planned that we're excited about. So now I'm loving it. And
Yeah.
you better believe, like after the Kim Kardashian episode, I was like this
Come on.
pumping the sky. I was
Oh,
so
yeah.
excited. But the episodes that I'm, probably most proud of are the ones that are the most journalistic. It's the story of the Central Park Karen done with Camille Foster and, which brought in a ton of tape and did the first interview with Amy Cooper. It's what we did for the Kyle Rittenhouse story. I think that people are resonating a lot with episodes that take something that they thought they knew about and blowing it up and showing them all the things that they were misled or lied about or just overlooked.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you, it's from every episode I've heard so far, you're doing a fantastic job. I didn't hear any of the practice episodes, and you really genuinely have a good voice for this medium. And I enjoyed listening to your book as an audiobook as well, because your voice is wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean that. I'll turn books off because I can't handle the voice of who's reading it sometimes. But I really enjoy yours.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if you were to just describe the focus of the show, how do you define it?
I define it, well, I think the title, which my sister came up with, who I'm working with, which is a dream, is pretty much captures it, which is honestly the way I frame it to people is, probably like you, Dan, I'm in all of these WhatsApp and Signal groups, and the gap between what people, especially prominent public facing people, say in private over dinner or on Signal and what they say on Twitter or in real life is massive. I'm trying to open up that Signal conversation and have it in public without fear. I'm trying to I believe that right now we're living in such a fearful time, a time where anyone knows that the smallest mistake or not mistake, just misinterpretation that they've made in public can ruin their lives. And so people are not being honest out loud. And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I love that. So one of the things that's interesting, especially for somebody with as prestigious a journalistic background as you have, is that you're now affiliating with advertisers directly, right? And by the way, I was in radio for 10 years, and this was always a fascinating thing because we had these church and state rules where news people could not do ads. You had to be an opinion person if you were going to do ads. So Bari, you take ads on the show, and I know that with Substack, it's subscription is the business model, but it's advertising driven on the podcast side because it's free to listen to. So how do you think about moving into this world, and what kinds of brands you'd like on the show, and where you draw lines?
Well, if Yeti or Tiva or Eileen Fisher is
Mm.
listening to this,
Mm-hmm.
love you guys. Love you guys a lot. No, it's a good. I mean, the reason that we're taking ads, frankly, is that I want this to be mass, and I want tons of people to listen to it. You mentioned that the Substack is subscriber only, but the dirty little secret that I'm very open about and proud of is that not a single story has ever been behind the paywall. Not a single one. And the reason for that is I want these stories to impact the culture. And so from a business perspective, not the smartest, and probably will change over time. But for now, I just don't see a way around it. If you want a story to go viral and you want everyone to read it, why would you put it behind a paywall? Now, you can look at someone like Business Insider and say they put all of their scoopiest things behind a paywall. It's obviously paying off for them. I don't have a clean answer for that yet.
Well, what's sort of interesting, your model may not scale, but it may be the right answer for you for a long time, because the premise of your whole world is intellectual honesty. And I think that there's a trust incumbent in that, where if you're like if you want to listen to honestly, like you're going to want to have like an honest exchange with the creator, and helping them monetize and pay for what they've created for you. So I think you'll probably be able to pull it off for a while. It would be fascinating to contrast your conversion rate, or how many people are just taking the free samples and leaving Costco without buying anything, right? It's interesting, and there's all different ways to do it. But I think it's really, really it's the best case scenario what you're doing, as long as you can pull it off, and you may have real legs to be able to pull this off for a long time.
But do you think, and maybe this is an impossible question to ask you, that the future of podcasting is going to be subscription or ads? Like, is the future what Sam Harris is doing?
Yeah. So no, the future is exactly what it is for all entertainment. And, I think about this a lot. And I've struggled with this as somebody that works in the advertising business, but it's like, do you watch Yellowstone or Succession?
I watch both. I'm a crossover person.
I am as well. Go figure. And
because we're purple people.
We're homeless, and also they're the same show. It's the same freaking show. Yes.
When Nellie and I watched Yellowstone, she was like, "Okay, it's Succession with ranchers and more sex."
Yeah. Oh, completely. You've got a Greg, like the dad, the patriarch, all of it. The turncoat, older son, everything. So, but that's not my point. My point is, same show. We agree on this. The opener of Yellowstone got 10x the opening episode of Succession.
It was like 1.5 to 14. Yeah.
So just think about it. 10% are going to pay the subscription. 90% can't. We're in an economy right now where a lot more people are racking up subscriptions online like crazy. Wait for the correction. A lot of that's going to smooth out. I think hybrid is the way. I think added, like, hey, if you want, like what Shapiro does at Daily Wire is interesting. I watched your interview with him, and at the end, boy, does he have a cliffhanger with you. And I'm like, I want to do that. But he's like, you're only going to get that if you're a subscriber, right? So I think that the paywalls will remain and they'll expand, but there is going to be a leveling. Only so many people will pay for a subscription. And we've seen that over and over with cable. We've seen it with Sirius satellite radio, which has some shows that are ad-free and purely funded by subscription, and some that are advertising supported. But it's all, I think it's a both and. It's like paper. Right?
I love that.
Yeah. So
and I love you're the rare person that's watching both.
We need more people doing this, but anyway, so I think that's where it's going, and I think you've got a great model, and I think it's a necessary model, because you can have a wonderful life and fantastic income and do big things as somebody who is primarily funded by the users themselves. But, ultimately what's going to happen is, you're going to be Joe Rogan and a big conglomerate is going to come offer you $100 million. And you're going to have to make a hard decision about whether or not you're going to go the way of everybody that's ever cashed in and sold out to the man, or you're going to stay indie and, do things your way. And this is how it goes, right?
From your mouth to God's ears. Let's hope that I have to face that.
Oh, we'll get there.
Question.
We'll get there. Hey, I want to workshop with you for a second. I want your perspective. I want to share with you what we're trying to do, like what our strategy is. And then I want to get your reaction to it, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
All right. So we come from an advertising perspective. Oxford Road is an ad agency that specializes in audio. We're about 9 years in. We work with a lot of direct-to-consumer brands, some blue chip brands, some startups. And what we started to see accelerate in a massive way since 2020 is we see a bias in sponsorship in the way that advertisers react to controversy. And we started seeing that people would, this is a relationship business. You're asking somebody to talk about your product or service. Somebody sends a tweet about them that may or may not be founded, and all of a sudden you sever the relationship. We felt that there should be some due process in this and some kind of ground rules that everybody operates on. We also see that there is an outrage industrial complex, and there are a lot of merchants of that on both sides of the aisle. I think that, I know you've talked about the Roger Ailes model that basically everybody's taken on. And what we want to do is be part of the solution. This podcast is part of that solution. And what we believe is that both sides, the proponents and critics of cancel culture, both sides have a point, but neither side has much of a strategy. So what we're trying to advance is helping facilitate brands to be really clear about what are their values. And so when they set up what content they're going to actually support with ad dollars, that they can have tools that will help them identify where there's going to be a fit in terms of values. But then when there needs to be market accountability, we don't believe in a no accountability, say anything you want to anybody at any time. But there should be a clearly defined process that we can all look at and go, okay, at least we're dealing fairly, because we don't have an FCC oversight on most of the content that so many people are consuming. There's no standards and practices. Everybody's going their own way. And our premise is that there needs to be some standardization here, and that brands who reach the Yellowstone group, which is 10 times as large as the subscriber constituency, that they can now serve a function sort of as the fifth estate and actually bring expectations to publishers and creators. And because they're holding the purse strings and they're all going kind of stakeholder capitalism, we're going to live by our values. We'll follow through on that. And so that's what we're trying to facilitate in a way that is even-handed. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we are trying to do. But I have heard you talk about how this is a metaphysical problem. And here we are trying to get engineer a super strategic, economic incentive solution to some of the polarization that media is accelerating. But you're saying it's much bigger than that.
I'm not sure I understand. So let me give you a scenario.
Yeah.
One of my litmus tests when I was thinking about who to work with on the podcast was, I really want to have Louis C.K. on the podcast.
Yep.
If I have Louis C.K. on the podcast, are you going to drop me from your network? And it was extremely clarifying, because anyone who balked at that idea of a guest, which everyone would want to hear that interview,
yes,
wasn't right for me. So let's say you're working with, some blue chip advertiser, and they commit to whatever standards language they agree to, right, with a creator. Right. We want to have honest conversations, check. We want to, stimulate conversation, drive a culture, blah, 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 blah. And then you have some kind of guest on that the internet decides is anathema or beyond the pale. Yeah. And they're tweeting incessantly at choose the brand. Yeah. You're telling me that some paper that someone signed committing to some set of values is going to stop them from caving? I don't get that.
That's an excellent argument and very true, that I think you can't get everything you want. On the other hand, I do think speed bumps help. I do think speed bumps slow people down. And I do think, this is such a, if you go all or nothing, you kind of get what you've got. And I don't feel like that's working very well. I do feel like reason would prevail if we actually could see what these rules that we're even adhering to are. But I also feel like we have a justice system in this country that we don't lean on very heavily in these cases. And so we're forming these mobs to create mob justice because there's no other law to deal with it. So I sort of feel like we need an infrastructure. Like I think the balance of the century is going to be spent trying to figure out how to sort out the internet. But what else can you do?
Well, you can basically say to a business, let's just take the Chappelle example.
Yeah.
The people that were pissed about his special were a pretty tiny minority on blue check Twitter and allied people in the company.
Yes.
Look at the numbers for that special.
Yeah.
Look at what people, like how the mass majority of Americans responded to it. It's the Yellowstone example. So I would say let's say there were ads on it, like I would say to those people who are maybe getting weak at the knees because they're getting tweeted at is, look at the business this is. Like, that's the thing that is so amazing to me is oftentimes it's actually not the bottom line that a lot of these advertisers are caving to. It's outrage on the internet that blows over after a day or two. I don't know. You're on the other end of it, so I'm curious if that seems true to you.
Yeah, I mean it's protective, and I do think there's been some dilution in the last couple of years. We went to, I think, the extremes of hypersensitivity. I do see some of that normalizing now a little bit. I mean, I think we've all gotten a little bit exhausted, to be honest. But I also think that people don't want to have to wear a scarlet letter that says that they violated they killed one of the sacred cows, right? And so context gets suspended. And so, for example, what we're doing with as many of our clients as we can is trying to set expectations beforehand, like, hey, you're entering an environment where there may be a whole range of issues. So, for example, one tactic that we have is we're partnered with Ad Fontes Media, which creates the media bias chart. Have you seen this?
No.
Oh, you got to Google media bias chart. So
maybe I've seen it. I'm sure I've seen it. I've seen every chart like this.
So left, right. This is kind of the original. Left, right. They have three people, one self-professing right, one self-professing left, one in the middle. They will go through and evaluate content and try to take a sample of sources and say, this is where we think this voice lands. And then they have a north-south on reliability versus misinformation. Now, it's a Rorschach. And if you see it, you're going to go, that shouldn't be there. That shouldn't be there. But the truth is, we're working with what we got. And right now, this is one of the best tools that we have. Now, we do think technology is going to help to an extent with this. There's never going to be a system that works really clean, but we're going to do the best that we can so that advertisers, when they come in, they have an idea of, all right, this is what we said as a corporation. These issues we're going to make a thing about. And we're actually going to live that out. Now, a lot of people made, like, if we're talking stakeholder capitalism, 2020, all these brands made all these big promises. And now, as they're doing accountability, most people are not able to keep up with their pledges, right? And so I think people are, corporations are getting a little bit more conservative in what promises they're going to make about what they're really going to, what hills they're going to die on. You go ahead.
I come at this from, I look at the example, let's say, of what Brian Armstrong did at Coinbase.
Yeah.
And his reaction to the past 2 years is, no politics in the office. And if you don't like that, like this whole idea of bring your whole self to work, no, maybe it's a bad idea to bring every single aspect of yourself to work, and basically gave extremely generous packages to anyone that left. Like, that to me is the provocative and interesting model. Their phrases like stakeholder capitalism, I don't actually know what they mean. I don't think anyone really knows what they mean. They mean anything you want them to mean. Don't you think?
I think yes and no. I think that it can be interpreted. Look, it's the same thing you talk about with journalism, right? Like, as long as it follows these secret rules, then like it's fine. So like, I do think there's an orthodoxy to it, but I also think that, like, look, here's where I came down. I used to take a position working in this business where I'm placing brands on right wing shows, left wing shows, right?
Yeah.
And my position used to be keep your head down. And the Brian Armstrong thing, I think, is a really, really interesting example. I don't think it scales. And I wish it would scale, but I don't think it scales. And what I
I mean, you're right, because it hasn't. No one else
well,
has done it.
and he did it. And, I think people do. There are companies that do, but they're not making as much noise. It's the quiet stuff, right? And it's a hard thing to do. So can we get to critical mass so that becomes the predominant approach? That would be really interesting. And if you were putting that on a ballot, I might vote for it. I don't know. But what I can tell you is doing this show and getting perspectives from everybody who's attacking this issue from every different angle under the sun. What I came to the conclusion of, this is the brands have decided, like, you look at institutional trust, who's on top right now? Corporations. It's not media. It's not government. And so right now, people are more trusting of the information they get from their employer than anybody else. Whether or not that makes any sense, or that's the way things ought to be, that's the way that it is. And so consequently, brands are going, all right, we have this new set of responsibilities. That's why, we're all weighing, you got corporations weighing in on Georgia voting rights. Like, how does that even make sense?
But it's deeper. Let's take the example of the NBA. It's like you have the NBA pulling out of North Carolina because of the bathroom bill.
Yeah.
And yet running training camps next to Uyghur genocide facilities.
Right.
What? Like,
yeah.
The hypocrisy. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's okay. I mean, this is what we're talking about. This is what we're trying to sort out, right? It's really messy and it's really broken. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that what with Media Roundtable, what we're trying to do is say, like, look, you've got values. Hopefully you think really hard about how far you want to go on these values, because at the end of the day, you can say it's stakeholders you're answerable to and your communities around you and everything else. Wait till you stop making money, and then let's see what your values are. Bottom line is a little underrepresented in this environment that we're currently living in. However, if you're not going to talk them out of it, and you're not going to get them to walk back what the expectations are of corporate America. And right now, with the labor dynamic that we have, you have very idealistic young people who have a lot of influence inside of corporations that they didn't used to have. So I don't think you can turn back the tide. What I'd like to see is the tide get channeled so that it doesn't become so simplistic that we go, hey, we're going to live by this woke ideology as the only option. Rather, can we have standards that we agree to and values that we uphold that are even-handed? And by the way, can we recognize that, if climate's an issue, is it possible that the speech that we have in this country and the way that we're dealing with people that are different than us is actually an existential threat? Like, can we acknowledge that polarization is a problem, and it's not necessarily the most advantageous thing for your stakeholders? If you have red pipes and blue pipes, and people either have to buy from Starbucks or Black Rifle Coffee, and there's nothing in the middle, they're going to start clipping off market share. So what we're trying to do is create a reservoir or an offshoot so that people can continue to stand for values, but those values don't have to be polarizing values. They don't have to be. And if we can agree on standards and practices, we can say, look, we're going to support free speech here, but listen, we all have lines. We all have things that we're not going to give light to or attention to because we don't think that they're actually doing a public service. And so we're trying to accept the momentum of what's already happening and try to come up with the best version that is realistic in that scenario. But that may be foolish, and that's why I brought up the revival piece. You made a statement about how really the death of God in this country is what's wrong with America. And I thought, oh, geez. And, here I am trying to get fancy with these economic incentives. And you're talking about things on a much bigger scale.
That's because that's what's interesting to me. I want to understand, like, the root cause of what's driving people mad, or so many people seemingly mad. I guess I would say, you can have every beautiful white paper in the world, and you can have an incredible mission statement. Go look at the New York Times.
Yeah.
All that matters is people. People are the mission. And if you have an epidemic of cowardice in the C-suites of lots of corporations, as we do right now, they won't matter a whit. It's just about the courage to stand by the things that you say. Now, I think it's very important to be, and I try and do this certainly in what I'm building and in my own life, put those things on paper and hold yourself and and make them public, at least to a circle of people you trust in the case of company I'm building, and then hold yourself to them. You're right. I think that like putting yourself on the hook in public will slow down your when you want to go weak at the knees, it might prevent you from doing so. But nothing prevents you from doing so other than, character in the end of the day.
Well, and I can't take issue with anything that you've just said. My concern is that in practical terms, courage is not necessarily maybe in the work that you're doing, because you can lead by example, you can demonstrate courage, and that will inspire courage in others. In our business, I think we're looking at our corner of the world and going like, okay, what if instead of trying to get them to be courageous, we could shift the incentive structure so they do the right thing for selfish reasons?
So give me a practical example so I understand what you mean. It could be a made up example, but I want to understand what you mean.
Sure. So if I'm a brand, we work with a lot of companies. They'll say no conservative or no political, right? Now, by the way, guess what? If you're actually measuring products and services sold, political is usually going to be one of your top performing genres for most products. You can have a rule like that, which many have today, or they go, yeah, we're open. And then they go into something, first tweet that somebody sends to them, they go, get us out of here, never put us there again, because there's too much attention on it. I'm saying lean into it, have a standard. And by the way, we've published these standards as recommendations to say, as a brand, can we figure out a way to identify which content has a point of view, but does it in a way that attacks the problem and not people? Is that possible? And can you apply that standard so that you have the freedom? Like I come at it from the standpoint of, if you're asking me, we need a strong conservative party, we need a strong liberal party. I believe that we need that push and pull. We need that tug of war to be successful in this country. But if you can't have a conversation, then you're dead. But can we agree that the way you have that conversation should be more than just ad hominem attacks? Because guess what? Both sides are doing that left and right. It's not working for us. So if brands could come and say, like, little bit of golden rule here, we support disagreement. We don't support things like labeling, name calling, certain standards that are really just incentivizing, pushing us apart. Can we pull the outrage incentive out of it and disincentivize outrage to allow for real discussion like the kinds that you're having to take place, and be something that brands can say, I can go there. I can go on Bari Weiss. I can't go on the one that's just just lobbing grenades all the time.
I think it has to do with you understand this market so much better than I do. Hopefully in a year from now.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think you're doing some I think the example that you're paving is a really interesting one to the extent that it scales. It is probably the best one to the extent that it scales.
What do you mean when you say that? The example that I'm setting? Because what I'm trying to do is go really slow and build the kind of trust with my audience that people used to have for establishment institutions. That's what I'm trying to do. Because you know how easy it would be every single day for me to run or speak about, the latest crazy thing, and they are crazy, going on at elite prep schools or colleges. It's the easiest thing in the world, and that puts money in my pocket. But I'm trying to do something that is I'm trying to put the long term ahead of my short term gain, very much.
Yeah, well, and I think that in a broader sense, what I'm saying is the right thing that you're doing. That's wonderful what you just described. To put it more broadly, what I see you doing is saying, I'm going to reject the filters applied by the dominant largest players in this space, because they're going to reduce me down to Fox News or New York Times.
Yes.
Because that's the incentive structure right now. What you've done is you've created a third path that says, I'm going to be independent, so I don't have to be told what to do and what to say, and we can do real journalism here. I think that is the ideal model. that hopefully you demonstrate by your vast wealth and success that other people will say that's a good model I should have. But look at it. I mean, look at Rogan, right? Like, I don't know that he's changed his perspective yet. He was actually able to go into the machine. And from what I can tell, he's still doing Rogan.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say that, first of all, it's very gratifying to hear you say that. Although I don't have vast wealth, not by a long shot, because I'm using every penny I earn to hire people and invest it into the company. But what I will say is that I am very careful about, you can imagine the kinds of shows I get invited on and everything. And
Yeah.
I'm trying to be shows with huge audiences that would grow mine.
Yeah.
But I try and be really disciplined about the things that I do, because trust is so precious.
Yes.
And it is so hard to build, and you can fritter it away in a day. And I'm just trying to not do anything that would compromise the trust that I hope that I'm building with my audience.
And Bari, I just want to thank you, because you're living it, you're breathing it, and all of the ideals we're trying to advance with Media Roundtable is what you're putting into practice in real life. So thank you for your courage and your sacrifice and the work that you continue to do.
You're so funny. I'm not a veteran and I'm barely brave, but thank you.
But you are a mensch.
Oh, thank you. See you at Shabbat.
See you at Shabbat. Thank you, Bari.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Of course. Just kidding. No. This show is dedicated to advancing our mission. Oh, wait, stop. I asked you about Jeremy. Who's Jeremy?
Jeremy Price, who set up this interview.
Gotcha.
I just put it in for this one.
Okay, Jeremy Price. Okay, got it. All right, here we go. This show is dedicated to advancing our mission of mobilizing marketers to advance truth and civility in journalism. We value clarity, truth, fairness, respect, de-escalation, and tolerance, and we invite you to connect with us at MediaRoundtable.com to learn more. Now, if you found the show helpful, you're committed to our cause, please follow us on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to listen. It's always free. And if you're a marketer trying to figure out how to live this stuff out, you can get in touch with our agency, Oxford Road, by going to oxfordroad.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Special thanks to Jeremy Price, Bianca, Kyle, Jennifer, and the team at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.